Hello, I'm Professor Andrew Lynch from the University of Miami and the Miami Observatory on Communication and Creative Industries. I'm glad to be able to present this segment of an interview that I conducted with Cuban-American novelist Cristina García, without a doubt one of the most highly regarded authors of U.S. Latino literature. Cristina García first met national critical acclaim in 1992 with the publication of Dreaming in Cuban. That novel, along with 4 others that she's published to date, are characterized by a highly poetic style of prose, bounded by themes of language and identity, nature and belief, possibility and place, time and memory. In this clip, I talked to her about the role of language in her novels. For many people, I think the concept of language is defined by words, phrases, sentences, texts. I sense in your work an argument about language as something much more transcendental. The last part of Dreaming in Cuban, in fact, is titled The Language is Lost. And I don't think it's referring really to Spanish or English, concretely. In that novel, Pilar's talent for painting is presented as a form of language. In the Agüero sisters, there's a pretty clear relationship between language and nature. In Monkey Hunting, between language and music. In A Handbook to Luck, there are numerous references to the language of birds. Did you always think of language in these sorts of terms, or is that something that you realized during the journey of becoming a novelist?
I think because I'm have an affinity for language, that for me everything is text. Everything is telling me a story, whether it's coming at me purely visually or through sound. You mentioned music or nature or whatever. For me, it's all a text. I mean, I always feel like I can run my hand over something, almost Braille-like, and read the stories. And so for me, whether I'm looking at a painting or a landscape or listening to Schubert or whatever it is, I'm continually, and it's not even so conscious, I'm continually translating it. So I think for me, I move through the world in a continual act of translation.
And that was true for you as far back as you can remember, or was there a certain stage in your life when you feel like that sense sort of emerged?
I just always remember doing that. I always, I remember, for example, on Saturdays going from Queens to Brooklyn, where I would go with my father, because he had a little store in Brooklyn Heights, and I would go and help him. I was maybe 9 years old and standing on I'd stand on a box to do the register, and all the old ladies would always be counting their change because they couldn't imagine a 9-year-old giving correct change, etc. But I remember even on that drive where we would go through, cross the Kosciuszko Bridge, and there was always the scent of this bakery, this big bakery factory. I would look in the cars of people driving by us, and I was always imagining their stories. And I didn't think that was particularly unusual. And I would be aware of, like, okay, in this car there's our stories, and yet every car has its own story. And I remember just being very intrigued by that. And probably it's no accident I ended up in journalism for a long time because of just that curiosity. But no, I mean, I read it. I don't know if I read it as text, but I translate almost everything I see into text and story.
What would you say is the original language of your work in conceptualizing it? Spanish or English?
Oh, definitely English. Yeah, but there are pockets of Spanish, and the pockets of Spanish come usually in dialogue. So when characters who would normally be speaking Spanish are speaking to each other, I hear the dialogue in Spanish and then translate it. But other than that, I think and write in English, but with with a sort of underlying pulse of Spanish for my Spanish-speaking characters. In other words, it's not necessarily the English I speak every day, or it's an English that's informed by the kind of underground river of Spanish, and that I think tries to accommodate its particular rhythms and surges and syncopations, and I try and do that with the English so that it captures something of the Spanish. And so my ideal would be that you're reading the story in English, but somehow still experiencing it in Spanish.
Would you consider writing in Spanish? Have you ever tried writing in Spanish?
Oh, God, no. It would just, it's hard enough in English, yeah. I've written a little bit of poetry in Spanish, but nothing that I would ever see the light of day. Yeah. But I read in Spanish. I read poetry in Spanish. It helps me so much, just in terms of rhythm and sound and even percussion.
There are fairly frequent insertions of Spanish words and phrases in your novels, and as a linguist, when I read your work, I like to try to figure out why you made particular insertions of Spanish, how you decided where to make them, when to make them, who they were coming from, what they were referring to, and I think that I may have found a possibly good explanation in Monkey Hunting. This is on page 54 of the novel, actually, when Domingo decides that other languages, and I quote the narrator's voice, other languages that you acquired didn't have the same memory-packed punch as the mother tongue. Would you say that this captures the essence of what would be the function of Spanish insertions in your discourse, or?
I think it's all about that. Although it doesn't make all that much logical sense either, because I'm still writing in English for the most part, and in the early novels almost everything is taking place in Spanish, and yet 95% of what's written is in English. So I think those insertions of Spanish are kind of punch-like, to punch through, almost just to remind you that this is going on in Spanish, and maybe to say things that would sound extremely awkward in English, and that even people with only a rudimentary knowledge of Spanish, say a second or third generation Cuban-American, not in Miami, who's not speaking much Spanish, would still understand. The abuelitas and the mijos and the, certain just little daily touchstones, and I think that's I think those phrases just have an umbilical cord back to the memory-packed punch of the mother tongue.
So, insertions of Spanish in terms of emotionality.
Absolutely, yeah.
In Monkey Hunting, when Domingo is fighting in Vietnam, he imagines the enemy speaking to him in fast Cuban Spanish, and the narrator there says, with hardly an S every 100 words. I find it curious that Domingo would project Cuban Spanish onto the Vietnamese enemy. Is the reader supposed to find this curious at all?
I think it probably has to do with language as an extension of physiognomy. I mean, there he was, part Chinese. He's Afro-Cuban Chinese, a soldier fighting for the Americans in Vietnam, but had more kind of physically in common with the enemy. I mean, just even on a pure visual sense, than he did with his corn-fed comrades, in the U.S. Army. And so he could very well imagine shooting at himself. They became a kind of mirror, I think, to who who he was, and I think it was preying on his sense of loyalties and affiliations, and in that moment, that sense of whom am I betraying by being on this side of the boundary.
That's fascinating. And so there wasn't any sense of hostility towards Spanish in that sort of instance?
No, I think there was a sense of identification and what the hell am I doing here, shooting on people who look like me. I can imagine them opening their mouths and coming back at me with a choice string of curses, Cuban curses or whatever. I think that's what I probably meant there.
In your novels, there are a lot of references, both implicit and explicit, to the problem of translation and even the inaccuracy of language. And in fact, in the Agüero sisters, Constancia notes, and I quote here, that Gonzalo's lies were blatant and unapologetic, inaccurate as language itself. Is language truly so problematic and deceitful?
Yes, I would say. I think even with our best efforts, certainly I could speak for myself, with my best efforts, even with phrases or passages that you're pleased with, which is already a hard sell because one works very hard on making these sentences sing, it still feels ultimately like an approximation, like a crude translation.
No matter how much you massage the sentence.
Well, it becomes less crude with the massaging, but ultimately, I think it's still. I used this phrase earlier, but still an act of audacity to try and capture experience in the vise of language. I think one can do it, and it feels almost like a temporary stopgap. Okay, I've caught this for a bit, but then it gets away, gets away from you again. And so, I don't know, I also, at the same time that it feels like an approximation, I also feel that it's kind of a necessary approximation, that you leave air, that it doesn't become something like some linguistic pheasant under glass, that it's, that the Caribbean and the breezes can cross through it and be open to interpretation and live beyond your rendering of a particular passage or series of words or whatever. So I think of it as something alive and uncapturable, if that's a word, essentially.
So would you say that translating from one language to another, say Spanish to English or vice versa, would somehow be easier than translating an idea or an experience into linguistic form to start with?
Oh, I think it just compounds the problem. I mean, I don't think it's easier. And I so admire the great translators. I mean, I don't know how many versions of Neruda's poems I've read because I've been so curious to see who does what. And so I have tremendous admiration for people who do that, because I think for me, just it's just stacked that much higher. The impossibility is that much more difficult to capture both the experience and render it believably and authentically in another tongue.
When you read your works translated into Spanish, is there a sense of satisfaction?
No, there's extreme discomfort, actually, because it's I think I write from an in-between place that's neither fully English or fully Spanish. And so English, it always feels like it falls short somehow in capturing the Spanish, as hard as I try. But then when it's rendered into Spanish, it's also missing a tremendous, to me, dimension in terms of wordplay and implication and reference and context. So I basically am never happy with this stuff, but I plug on regardless.